Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And good morning again. And actually, I guess I don't know if it's morning where everyone else is. It's morning where I am. But happy to be here with you and talk a little bit about team dynamics this morning. Again, my name is Joe Gerstandt. And the bulk of the work that I've done over the past decade or so has been focused on issues related to diversity and inclusion. And so I help organizations find some new clarity around those issues and put some new practices in place. And a lot of my focus in focusing on diversity and inclusion has been on the level of group and team dynamics. I've observed a lot of teams at work. I've spent a lot of time studying team dynamics and trying to identify some of the things that make teams more successful than others. I think one of the ideas or the beliefs that is holding us back a little bit is the idea that if we just have talented individuals, if we just are able to find and hire talented or smart or competent individuals and group them together, we will have smart or talented or competent groups. And it really doesn't work that way at all. On the group level, there's a bunch of other variables involved. And I think this issue is increasingly important to us because we're doing today more and more of our work together. We're doing more and more of our work in teams and groups, committees, and task force. And so I think we do still need to focus on individual talent, but I think we also are needing to shift some of our focus and attention to focusing on what makes a talented team, because it's a different set of things. And because we are doing more of our work as groups and teams, having a conversation about what makes a talented team, I think, is increasingly important. And so I'm going to cover some of that information this morning, and some of it's based on my experience, some of it's based on research, but one of the things I like to let folks know in advance is that I'm pretty easy to find. Here's my contact information. If you have a question, a comment, or a complaint that we simply don't have time to get to today, or if something comes up after the fact, please feel free to reach out to me, send me an email. I'll do my best to answer your questions or at least point you in the right direction. I'm going to reference some research this morning. If you want to know more about that, again, I can point you in the right direction. So I'm pretty easy to find. I'm going to start by sharing a story, kind of a classic example of team dynamics gone awry, and it's a true story, but it's kind of old, and I'm going to review it real quickly and tease some things out of it that I think are very relevant to this particular conversation. The story takes us back to the mid-'80s. On January 28th of 1986, NASA launched the Space Shuttle Challenger. And it was the 10th and final time that they launched the Challenger, because 73 seconds into flight, the space shuttle started to come apart and it basically disintegrated over the Atlantic Ocean. 7 astronauts lost their lives, and it was in this country at least, it was a national disaster. It was a tragedy, and when that happened, NASA immediately shut down the space shuttle program. They indefinitely shut down the space shuttle program, and they put together a very serious accident review board. It was called the Rogers Commission, and the Rogers Commission had a lot of authority and power and resources to go in and investigate, to study and analyze and research, to learn as much as they possibly could about how and why this had happened so that NASA could learn from it. And the Rogers Commission went about their work, and pretty early on they had some clarity regarding what the physical or the mechanical cause of this disaster was. They learned that an O-ring had failed to seal at liftoff. One of the O-rings on one of the external booster rockets had failed to seal at liftoff, and that very quickly led to the demise of the space shuttle. Even though they knew what the mechanical or the physical cause of this disaster was, much of their time and attention was focused on the people and the people processes leading up to the launch decision. And they ended up having some very strong things to say about NASA when they released their final report. In the report, they say, we believe that the organizational culture at NASA had as much to do with this disaster as the physical or the mechanical failure, which is, I think, a pretty profound thing to say. Again, we had lost an entire space shuttle, 7 astronauts had died. It was a pretty tragic event, and they're blaming the organizational culture as much as they are for the physical, as much as they are the physical or the mechanical failure. I think that's worth paying attention to, because sometimes I think we downplay the significance of organizational culture, and I think this is a reminder that organizational culture is one of those things that's always operating in the background, and it pushes on our thinking and it pushes on our behaviors and our decisions. A lot of their attention, before they released that report, a lot of their attention was focused on a particular conversation a conversation that took place the day before the launch on Monday, January 27th. Less than 24 hours before the space shuttle launch, there was basically an emergency conference call that took place. It involved three groups of people. It involved engineers from a company called Morton Thiokol. Morton Thiokol was a contractor with NASA. They were responsible for designing and maintaining and monitoring many of the things and systems and components on the space shuttle. This conference call involved engineers from Morton Thiokol, senior managers from Morton Thiokol, and senior managers from NASA. These three groups of people get together on the phone the day before the launch, and the conference call had been requested by the engineers from Morton Thiokol. And they requested the conference call because they were concerned about the performance of the O-ring. Actually, all of these people were concerned about the performance of the O-ring. This O-ring had been problematic as far back as 1976, 1978, somewhere in there. This particular O-ring had actually failed on previous shuttle launches. Never to the extent that it failed in January of 1986, but it had been an issue. It wasn't performing the way that it needed to be. And because it had been an issue, the engineers had been going back and trying to figure it out. They've been going back and looking at data. They've been trying to pick up on patterns, trying to figure out why is this particular O-ring performing differently than other O-rings. And they were starting to come to the conclusion that it was temperature related. They were starting to come to the conclusion that this particular O-ring seems to perform worse the colder it is when we launch. And this was of great concern to them because January 28th of 1986 was forecasted to be the coldest launch date that NASA had ever had. You can see this is a picture taken the morning before the launch. It's not a great picture, but you can see there's ice hanging off of the bottom of the space shuttle or the space shuttle rigging around the shuttle. It was cold, and they knew that it was going to be cold. So as they were realizing that this O-ring was heavily influenced by air temperature, at the same time realizing that they had a very cold launch date coming up, they were concerned. They request this emergency conference call, and so these three groups of people get together on the phone. And in this conversation, the engineers from Morton Thiokol say, we do not believe that you should launch the space shuttle. We believe that the O-ring will fail. We believe that it may fail catastrophically. And when they said this, NASA responded basically by saying two things. They said, one, we will not launch without a thumbs up from Morton Thiokol, and two, we're appalled at your recommendation that we should not launch, which is kind of interesting information to travel together. And in 1986, if you're a company like Morton Thiokol and your business is making things for space shuttles, NASA's a really big deal. NASA's kind of the entire universe for you. So when NASA responds this way, the managers from Morton Thiokol say, can we have a minute? Can we speak privately with our engineers? And NASA says, absolutely, please do that. So the managers and the engineers from Morton Thiokol leave the conference call for 20, 25, maybe 30 minutes, and then the managers come back on the conference call without the engineers. And in the second part of this conference call, these two groups of people vote unanimously to move forward with the space shuttle launch, to disastrous results. And it's completely unfair for us to sit here with all of our perfect hindsight and pick this apart, but that's what we have to do to learn from it. And I think there are some valuable and some relevant things that we can learn from this, even though it's a story of something that happened a very long time ago and in kind of a unique situation. I think there are some aspects of this story that are very relevant and applicable to us, regardless of what kind of organization we work in or what kind of work we do. One of the things that sticks out about this story is the importance of difference. Diversity takes a lot of different forms, but the word itself means difference. And one of the things that we know about group processes, things like problem solving and decision making, is that difference is a really important part of it. And when this decision-making process began at NASA, there was some important difference or diversity inside of that process. There was this diversity of opinions or beliefs about what the right thing to do moving forward was. But rather than holding on to that difference and dealing with the conflict and the tension that would certainly come with it, rather than holding on to that difference and wrestling with it and trying to use it to find their way to the best decision, they allowed that difference to exit the process. And those of you that are listening this morning, you may not be involved in putting things or people up into space, but regardless of where you work, decisions matter. Decisions made in your organization have consequences. And I think the underlying dynamic of what happened at NASA probably shows up in all of your organizations on a pretty regular basis. Right? The underlying dynamic of what happened in this story is groupthink. This is kind of a classic example of groupthink. And a lot of times when I say the word groupthink or when I put that word up there, I think we have a tendency to think of these extreme situations where you've got a tyrannical supervisor you've got a tyrannical supervisor, and they won't allow anyone else to have their own point of view or their own opinion, and those are real things. That happens from time to time, but I believe that most groupthink isn't a product of tyrannical supervisors or even incompetency. I think a lot of groupthink happens just because of human nature. I think a lot of groupthink happens because sometimes we just don't feel like getting into it today. We don't feel like fighting or arguing or debating, and so we just nod our head and we go along in agreement. I think it happens because some of us are very conflict averse. I think there's a lot of reasons why it happens. The underlying point is that I think it happens a lot. The more that I look for it, the more that I see it. And I've come to believe that groupthink is, for most teams, most organizations, groupthink is kind of the default way of operating. For the most part, we avoid serious disagreement at all costs, and that's incredibly dangerous, because disagreement done well is a really important aspect of decision making and problem solving. And again, this is also a reminder to us that it's not enough just to have smart individuals, right? NASA didn't make the wrong decision because they don't have smart people working there. NASA has crazy smart people working there. They have very smart, very competent, very talented people working there. As groups, they still have, from time to time, have made bad or poor decisions because they got sloppy with the process. They got sloppy with the process. In this particular instance, instead of utilizing that conflict to drive good decision making, they removed conflict or that difference of opinion from the process. And so I think this is an opportunity to think a little bit about decision making at your organization. And organizations make a lot of different kinds of decisions. There are big formal decisions with long-term consequences. There's smaller tactical decisions. But in general, as you think about how decisions are made in your organization, are you intentional about the process? Are you intentional about having a healthy relationship with conflict? Are you intentional about doing disagreement well? Because I think those things are all pretty difficult. They're hard work, and so they basically don't happen unless we're pretty intentional about making sure that they do happen. And I like this quote from Jim Nightingale. I think decision-making is one of the most important things that we do inside of our organizations, but I don't find a lot of leaders or a lot of organizations that are very intentional about how we make decisions. They just start making decisions, and they don't think about the process and the participants and those types of things. So I think there's a whole bunch of potential. I think there's a whole bunch of opportunity for us to tighten up our approach to group processes in general, but specifically decision-making and problem-solving, and drive better outcomes. Decision-making is one of the most important things that your organization does. In fact, I think you could make the case that it's the most important thing, because the decisions that are made touch and influence and inform everything that does happen. Decision-making is incredibly important, and it's also really difficult, right? It's emotionally difficult, especially if there's conflict involved. It's some of the most important work. It's some of the most difficult work, but we take this very hands-off approach to how we do it. I can walk into most organizations and fairly quickly find written, explicit expectations for where employees are supposed to park, how to request vacation, proper use of name badge, but I can almost never find any written public agreements on this is how we make decisions here, and this is how we deal with disagreement. So some of the most important and some of the most difficult work that we do, our approach to it is very not intentional. It's very inconsistent. It changes from day to day, meeting to meeting, and boss to boss. And I think there's a fair amount of waste in there, and sometimes pretty extreme situations. The NASA story is kind of an extreme case, but I think the underlying dynamic of groupthink, again, is something that happens a lot. It's probably happening inside your organization right now. It's a very common group dynamic. And again, one of the things that we want to do is we want to get away from the idea that if we just group smart people together, we'll end up with smart groups. On the group level, there's a bunch of other things involved. On the group level, individual ability is a pretty small variable. Some of the bigger variables are, do we have a diverse group of people together, and are they willing and able to tell the truth to each other? Can they challenge each other, and can they disagree with each other? That is at the heart of really high-performing teams when it comes to these things like decision-making and problem-solving. And part of what we are taking advantage of or utilizing or harvesting in those situations is the cognitive diversity, or the diversity of mental perspectives and orientations that exist in a particular group. A lot of our conversations about diversity are based on identity diversity, differences in who we are. Cognitive diversity is a different kind of diversity. It's differences in how we think, our mental orientation, our perspectives, our heuristics, things like that. We want to bring groups of people together that are willing and able to tell the truth to each other, so that we can benefit from the different things that are in each of our minds or each of our brains. And beyond giving you a kind of an academic definition of what cognitive diversity is, I also want to give you a little bit of a framework or a model for simply thinking about it. This is a simple overview of a model developed by a gentleman by the name of Ned Herman. Some of you may be familiar with him or his work. His model is called the HBDI, I believe, Herman Brain Dominance Index. I think that is correct. But Ned Herman wrote some books and has spent most of his life studying team dynamics and creativity and problem solving, and developed a model. And it's similar to a lot of other profiling tools out there. There's Myers-Briggs and Strength Finders and Emergenetics. I'm sure some of you are familiar with those things. The Myers-Briggs is a pretty popular one. There's a number of different tools out there. This is simply one of those profiling tools that's based on mental orientation. Based on his research, there's 4 kind of dominant mental orientations, and each of us has one of these that we're kind of more dominant in. So take a few seconds and just look at this slide. You've got 4 quadrants, and they're different colors, and in each quadrant are 5 or 6 characteristics. And take a look at those and try to find the one that kind of best identifies you. If you were going to put yourself in one of these colors or quadrants, which one would it be? Which set of characteristics kind of speaks to you most? I believe what his research says is that we have the ability to do all of these things, but in each of us, one of these is a little bit stronger than the others. It's kind of more natural. So especially when the pressure is on, when push comes to shove, that's kind of how we function. And then once we've kind of identified where we're at, we can see if you think it's valid at all. For those of you that are the upper left-hand folks that are in that blue quadrant, maybe or maybe not, maybe this resonates with you. You enjoy solving technical problems, analyzing complex issues, logic, not crazy about interpersonal stuff, not crazy about the icebreakers, the exercises that we do sometimes in sessions. If you're in the upper right-hand corner in that yellow quadrant, you're kind of more in line with conceptualizing, innovating, and you're a little bit frustrated by routine meetings, details, structure. I can certainly understand that myself. I tend to be in that yellow quadrant myself. Lower left-hand corner, the greens tend to be good at following through on things and implementing. The lower right-hand corner, the reds are good at expressing ideas. They really enjoy the team dynamics and the personal stuff, and not so crazy about the logic. And you can probably put yourself in one of these quadrants, and I think intuitively we do know that we think differently, that we actually us to keep this top of mind, not only because it's true that we do, whether we completely buy into this particular model or not, it is true that we are oriented differently. We have different perspectives. We see and process things differently. Not only is that true, not only is that one of the things that's operating behind our behavior, but we also know now more than ever before that there is tremendous potential at the intersection. When you intentionally bring those different ways of seeing things together, that's a really valuable thing to do. That's a really powerful thing to do. That is at the heart of team genius. That is at the heart of really powerful decision-making and problem-solving, intentionally bringing different perspectives together. And for some of you, that's intuitive as well. You're maybe nodding and thinking to yourself, I've kind of always approached things that way. But this is one of those things that's a little bit easier said than done, because not only is there great potential at that intersection, that's also where tension and conflict live. Right? Because not only can you look up at these 4 quadrants and find the group that you belong to, you can probably also find the group that makes you a little bit crazy, right? Because they use different language, they have different priorities. You want to talk about numbers, they want to talk about ideas, or vice versa. And so this is kind of where the seeds of the roots of tension and conflict take place. And that's good as long as we do it in a right way, but it's also very hard work. Right? It's hard work. Sometimes it seems threatening and emotional. And so even though we may believe in the idea that we need to bring those different perspectives together, we need to be in that intersection, it's still kind of hard work. And I think left to our own devices, we still have a tendency to avoid that intersection. And again, most teams that I observe, work teams, management teams, executive teams, boards of directors, most teams that I observe avoid serious disagreement at all costs. And again, I think there's opportunity for improvement there. And there's some research, some pretty strong research to support that. I'm gonna walk you through a scenario here of thinking about how 2 different kinds of teams might compete against each other. And so that the two teams are somewhat consistent and they kind of come from the same pool of talent, we're going to say that our audience for this scenario is the graduating MBA class at Harvard University. We'll say there's 100 people in that class, and we're going to pull two teams from out of this group and have them compete against each other. The first team is the top 10 by grade point average, the 10 people in this class that have the highest grades. We all know who those people are. They're the people that talk about their grades all the time. That's team number one. Team number two comes from the same place, but they're drawn at random. So unlike team number one, who is all kind of clustered tightly together, they're all performing in very similar ways at Harvard University. Team number two is kind of all over the place. Some of them have high grade point averages. Some of them have low grade point averages. They're all over the place. They're performing in very different ways. These are your two teams. And so think to yourself for a second, who do you think is better at solving problems? If you were a wagering person and you wanted to bet on this competition, if these two teams sat down and were faced with a complex thing to solve, which team would you be quickest to get behind? Which team would you put your money behind? And when I asked this to groups in person, almost everyone raised their hand for team number two, as if it were common sense. But I think it's not common sense. I think this is a conversation that's a little bit about diversity, and people are kind of seeing where I go. But in groups where I'm presenting in person, probably 80 or 90% of the room think that team number two is going to win. And what the research says, fortunately for us, the study has already been done. What the research says is that when team number two is able to communicate and work together, they do consistently beat team number one. Now, the fact that they need to be willing and able to communicate and work together, that's kind of a really big point, and we'll come back to that in just a moment, because oftentimes team number twos aren't actually able to do that. But what the research shows, when they are able to do that, they consistently beat team number one, and the reason behind that is because they are the team that has greater cognitive diversity, greater diversity of mental inputs. When we think about these two teams, they are attending Harvard University and they're participating in the MBA program. If we take a look at the 10 folks on team number one, they're all doing really, really well there. They're getting the best grades in the class. And a big part of the reason for that is they are using some of the best tools that they can for their work. Their perspectives, their heuristics, their shortcuts, their mental models, how they do their work mentally is very effective and very efficient, and there's not a lot of variance in how they do their work. There's a lot of similarity in how those 10 folks do their work mentally. There's a lot of similarity in their mental orientations. If we take a look at the folks in team number two, there's not nearly as much consistency in their performance. They're all over the place. They've got high grade points, low grade points, stuff in the middle. And one of the reasons why there's so much variance in their performance is that there's so much variance in the tools that they use mentally to do their work. Right? There's just a great deal of variance. They're all approaching their work in very different ways. And so when team number two comes together as a group, they have a much larger mental toolbox to choose from because there's so much variance in what they use. Team number one has a much smaller toolbox to select from because there's so much similarity in what they use. And team number two, when they are able to communicate and work together, they consistently beat team number one. Again, the fact that they need to be able to communicate and work together is kind of a big deal because team number two has to deal with something that team number one doesn't. Team number two has to deal with a certain amount of conflict, right? When you have a whole bunch of different approaches to something, you have to be able to communicate and figure out a way to make some decisions of where you're going to start. Team number one doesn't have to do much of that. They can kind of hit the ground running. They don't have a lot of decisions to make. There's a lot of similarity in how they approach their work already. They can kind of hit the ground running. Team number two can't do that. They've got to figure some things out. They've got to make some decisions. If they can't do that, they don't ever beat team number one. And the kind of the general rule of thumb regarding diversity in work groups is that groups with greater diversity overperform or underperform groups with less diversity. The decision point is, do we have a healthy relationship with conflict? Are we able to disagree with each other respectfully and effectively make decisions and move forward as a team? The payoff is pretty high. The payoff is pretty high. Again, you get that superior group process, but there is a fair amount of work in being very intentional in how we approach those conversations and dealing with those differences. Scott Page did that research. He went on to write a number of journal articles. This is one of them. And he also went on to write a book called The Difference. If you really want to dig into the science behind cognitive diversity and group process, I highly recommend it. It's by far the most robust science that I've seen applied to the work. Scott Page, The Difference. And I believe at the end of my slide deck, I think I've got a couple of slides with book recommendations, but that's one of them. Scott Page, The Difference. And he's been running around saying that when it comes to group processes, things like decision-making and problem-solving, we can actually say that diversity trumps ability. But we probably shouldn't do that, especially with folks that haven't benefited from this particular conversation, because that might sound like a crazy thing to say. But what we can at least do, and I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, what we can at least do is we can start having a different conversation about talent. We can start talking about talent on the group level. And when we're talking about talent on the group level, diversity is certainly a part of that conversation. Even if we're just focusing on cognitive diversity, people that have different mental orientations, different perspectives, different experiences, we can very much say with some very solid science that that is one of the big indicators of talent on the group level. And so I think that's a pretty important contribution. But again, it's not about just bringing a particular kind of group together. We also have to be very intentional about the container that we're putting that group in. We have to be very intentional and thoughtful about how are they going to interact with each other, what are going to be the rules and agreements. Those things are very important because it's a very different experience to be on team number one compared to being on team number two. If we go back to those two teams and we ask them some questions, there's some interesting things that pop up. If we go back and we talk to team number one, a couple of interesting things. One, they think there's no doubt in their mind they're much better at solving problems than team number two, even though that's not entirely accurate. And the second point is that they would do it again. They enjoyed the process. They would sign up to do that kind of work again with that particular group. Team number two that does have actually the higher problem-solving capacity, if we go back and talk to them, a couple of things emerge. One, they don't think they're very good at solving problems, and two, they wouldn't do it again. They did not enjoy the process. Being on a group that all agrees with each other, or at least pretends to agree with each other, is a very easy experience. Being on a group that has to fight and argue and do some debating is a much more taxing experience. And so it's not enough to just say, we need to argue more. We have to think, especially as leaders and HR folks, we need to make sure that we are giving folks the resources and the tools and practices to make that less of a challenging, intimidating, risky thing to do. And I think that that's where a lot of our focus needs to be. Some of it needs to be focused on who we're bringing into that conversation or that team or that process, but I think the biggest opportunity is to focus on the how. How are we interacting? How are we going to be together as a team? Because there's some pretty strong patterns of behavior that I pick up on. I tend to see groups that either get stuck kind of just agreeing, or once in a while I find groups that get stuck kind of all they do is disagree. They just fight, fight, fight. It doesn't matter what the topic is. The United States Congress is maybe a good example of this. It doesn't matter what the topic is. They're just going to fight, fight, fight. And neither one of those approaches are valuable. We want our conversations, our groups, all of our social spaces to be able to benefit from some of both of those things. I think a baseline indicator of a healthy relationship or social space is, have we proven the ability to both agree and disagree with each other? Or do we primarily just do one of those things? When we have teams or relationships that get stuck down here, all they do is disagree with each other. There's usually a lack of trust there. Sometimes there's an us versus them dynamic. Sometimes there's personal conflict baked into that. We just disagree with each other all the time because we don't like each other. If we have a group or a relationship that gets stuck down on the other end where all they do is agree with each other, there's a lack of honesty there for some reason. Sometimes this happens just because we're lacking skills. If I don't know how to do conflict well, I'm probably going to end up keeping my perspective to myself. Sometimes the expectations aren't there, sometimes the skills aren't there, and these are usually groups that sometimes have to have the meeting after the meeting where you tell the truth to a smaller group of folks. But again, the point is that we don't want to get stuck in either end of this continuum. We want some of both, even in our one-on-one relationships. If one of these is missing, If all we do is agree or all we do is disagree, something is wrong with that relationship. Something is wrong with that space. We want to make sure that we are able to do some of both of those things. The architecture, the basic architecture for group processes like decision making and problem solving is divergent thinking on the way to convergent thinking. We want to be very intentional about making sure that we are starting off with as much diversity of input as possible, and we also want to be very intentional about getting to a decision point. We want people to come in with a lot of different ideas and points of view, but we want to leave with one particular point of view. That's kind of the architecture that we want to put in place. Few simple practices that I'm going to share with you. Just a few simple practices, maybe not necessarily always easy, but simple things, fairly easy, fairly simple, not time-consuming things that can help you be a little bit more intentional in your approach to those group processes. And the most important one up front is to have some rules or some agreements in place. Before we start making a decision, have we discussed how we're going to make the decision? And I'm not going to get into a debate about different decision-making styles or models today. There's a lot of stuff out there that's available, but in general, do you want to make decisions as a dictator? Is it going to be a democracy? Are you going to make decisions by consensus? Regardless of how you're going to make decisions, does everyone know in advance how the decision is going to be made? Because I almost never see that happen. What I see is groups just wade into the conversation, and then 15 or 20 or 30 minutes later, someone says, are we making a decision here? Are we making a recommendation? Are we brainstorming? People don't even know exactly what they're participating in. And if we want people's full participation, they've got to have some clarity up front about how it's going to be done. Are we making a decision? Okay. How is the decision going to be made? We're going to have 20 minutes of robust conversation. I'm the boss. I'm going to make the decision after that. As long as people know that up front, they have some idea of how to participate. They have some idea of what's going on. And you should give them some guidance on how to participate as well. A lot of times we have conversations that are dominated by a couple of people. We continue to act like we're surprised by that. We shouldn't be surprised by that. It's pretty predictable. If we don't want one or two people to dominate the conversation, then we have to put a rule or an agreement in place to make sure that doesn't happen. One of the things that I use is what I call serial sharing. I don't ever open the floor up for conversation. When we're discussing an issue, it's pretty structured as far as how we interact. But serial sharing is not opening the floor for conversation. It's rather saying, all right, everyone is going to go on the record right now on how they feel about this particular issue, and each of you is going to have exactly 60 seconds or 3 minutes or 9 minutes or whatever the appropriate amount of time is, but they get exactly that much time, and actually a buzzer goes off when their time is up. And now all of a sudden you've got very balanced input. You've heard from everybody in the organization, and you don't have the conversation dominated by one or two people. Another rule that I like to use is always make sure that the boss speaks last. The boss's perspective, the person with the most power in the room, their perspective will influence people. Once they talk, some other people's opinions or ideas are going to shift. And so the later in the conversation they can speak, the more that diversity of input you can get. But having some agreements. What are we doing? How are we doing it? How are you expected to participate? All of those things are very valuable. And if you want your team to have a healthy relationship with conflict, there should also be some of that stuff in here as well. We're expected to disagree with each other. It's a natural thing. It's a good thing for us to disagree with each other as long as we do it in the right way. And for our organization, our team, here's some things that you need to know about what respectful disagreement is. Write it down, put it on the wall, and then it becomes something that belongs to everyone. It becomes a thing that we can improve and learn from and tweak moving forward. And I think another one of the things that I always like to include in that is kind of certain ways to participate in the meeting, because even if you've got a decision-making approach and things are kind of laid out, it can still be undermined by the way that people participate or communicate. And I see a lot of passive-aggressive communication in meetings, sometimes overly aggressive communication, sometimes overly passive, and what we should really be going for is pretty assertive communication, where we have some courage and we are going to advocate for our point of view, but we also are considerate of the group and the team process. We're participating in inquiry more so than advocacy. We're trying to participate in the group finding the best decision rather than me advocating for my particular point of view. The more specific we get about what participation in these processes looks like, the easier it is for us to hold people accountable. The more of this stuff that you build out, the easier it is to build it into performance evaluations and promotion decisions and all those kinds of things. So I think there's a lot of benefits to being thoughtful and intentional up front about how we are going to interact with each other as a team, as a group, as a task force. One of the other things that's really important, I think, in group processes is to what I refer to as work to have a beginner's mind. We have this bad habit, I know at least in the States, we have a tendency to say that we are open-minded and non-judgmental. And it simply isn't true. As human beings, we are automatically and relentlessly judgmental. There's no hatred or fear required. We are just automatically judgmental beings. And if we want to reduce the impact of that stuff, we have to stop acting like it doesn't exist and be intentional about it. And so rather than walking around and patting ourselves on the back for being open-minded and non-judgmental, I try to take a more activist approach in working to have a beginner's mind. Shunryu Suzuki was one of the first American Zen masters that came to the States, and he used to talk to his students about having a beginner's mind. He said it's a really powerful way to interact with ideas and people and communication, because a beginner's mind is full of opportunity, it's full of possibilities, it's easy for beginners to learn. Experts, on the other hand, have a hard time learning stuff because they already know everything. And if you've ever tried to teach experts that, you know that it's kind of like trying to pour water into a glass that's already full. It doesn't work very well. So one of the things that we need to do on the individual level when we're interacting in a group process or a conversation or a decision-making effort is work to have a beginner's mind. Put our expertise aside, put the things that we think we know about the issue and the people involved aside, and take the stance of a beginner, take the stance of a student. Do more listening, ask more questions, look for and challenge assumptions. That in itself is a powerful practice, looking for and challenging assumptions. This question alone, do I know this about this person, this issue, or this group, or do I think I know this? And if I say that I know it, where's the evidence? Where's the data? Because we make decisions based on a lot of unchallenged assumptions. Assumptions about people and assumptions about issues. But that our tendency to jump to conclusions and make assumptions and operate on what we think we know is one of the things that gets in the way of good, robust decision making. And we can even go back to the NASA story that I started with. If you take a look at the transcripts of the conversations that were taking place after the engineers had been allowed to leave the conversation, you've got two groups of managers, and they're kind of trying to justify what's just happened. Right? They're trying to make a big, complex decision. They've just allowed all the engineers to leave the conversation. And the things that they're saying to each other aren't about the argument that the engineers made. It's not about the data. They're talking about the problems with engineers. Right? They're dismissing the information that came from the engineers because of who they are, because they're engineers. They were saying things to each other like, you know how engineers are, they get all wrapped up in the numbers, they can't see the big picture. And I think we do that stuff a lot. We're not very good at considering ideas on their own merit. We filter that through who it comes from. Right? We think we know certain things about the motivations of managers, the motivations of engineers, the motivations of people that work in marketing and HR, and sometimes we dismiss what they say because of that. And we lose valuable ideas and information right there. So it's important, I think, especially for those of us that are leaders, especially of us that work in the human resources, human capital space, to keep top of mind the fact that we are actually very automatically, naturally, and relentlessly judgmental. And if we're not doing stuff to push back on that, that in itself can compromise and undermine our decision making. And one last practice that I like to share before I bring this to a close and give you guys some time to land some questions. This particular practice is what I call taking the third chair perspective. A lot of times, and I use it in a group conversation once we've gotten to the point where we've got some debate going on, we've got two or more points of view surfaced, I use it then. I think we're pretty good at knowing what our point of view is. We're pretty good at knowing when someone disagrees with us, but a lot of times that's about as far as it goes. We don't actually really fully understand that person's perspective and where they're coming from. And the third chair perspective is a practice to kind of push back on that. What it is once we've got a little bit of disagreement going on, what I do is I stop that and I make people take turns explaining each other's point of view. Right? Because if I can't fully explain your point of view, that means I don't fully understand it yet. And I have some more listening and learning to do. It's one thing to disagree with each other. It's another thing to really understand where each other are coming from. And one of the beautiful things that happens when you can do that is it allows us to explore the space in the middle a little bit more. It makes it easier for us to not fight between is your approach the best one or is my approach the best one, but is there another alternative? Could we take some of your idea and some of your idea and some of someone else's idea, put them together and come up with something that none of us could have come up with on our own? That's a pretty beautiful thing and a pretty powerful thing, but it rarely happens unless we're able to explore that place in the middle, unless we really understand where each other are coming from. And this is a great way to check it. Stop the argument and take turns explaining each other's point of view to prove that we really understand what each of us are talking about. So a few simple practices that I think you can experiment with, and they've been very effective in my experience working with a lot of different groups and teams. I encourage you to experiment with those. But that's, we're about 40 minutes in. I think I'm going to stop now and give those of you that are listening and watching a chance to share some questions or share some observations of your own, and I'll do my best to respond or to answer your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Joe Gerstandt. Folks, we are now open for question and answers. If you have any questions, you could either put it in the question box or you could equally raise your hand. There is a hand icon available on the webinar console, so if you click on it, you can even have an audio conversation with Joe. Let me go straight to the question box. We have a couple of questions. The first one, what are some of the quick tips you would give for building an atmosphere of cooperation within team members, enabling us to measure their contribution towards achievements?
That's a good question. I think I don't know if I have a quick, simple answer to that. I think, you know, fostering collaboration, I think one of the things that's really important to that, and one of the things that's really important to everything that I've just said, but hasn't even been mentioned yet, is the importance of trust. I think it's a lot easier to tell the truth to people that you trust. I think it's a lot easier to challenge people that you trust. Trust is a really important thing, and I don't think trust is a quick thing. I think it takes time, and I think what I see a lot of our organizations doing is kind of carving the social space and the social time out of our organizations, because we've come to believe that it's not work-related, and I think it's really work-related, because that's how you build trust. You build trust by spending time with each other, doing things with each other, getting to know each other, and some of that just isn't work-related. But the trust component is. Trusting relationships, you know, there's going to be times when those are really, really valuable to your organizations. You can do things faster when you trust each other. You can challenge each other more when you trust each other. And so I think one of the most important things you can do, it's not a quick, simple thing, but one of the most important things that you can do to foster collaboration is to focus on building trust with each other. And trust doesn't come from titles, and it doesn't come from org charts. Again, it comes from people spending time together and doing things to each other. But I think that trust is a really, really important thing. I think, you know, I see a lot of data that says employees aren't comfortable telling the truth to each other. And I think that's because we haven't done enough to build trusting relationships between them. So I think that's one of the most important things. Great question, because you brought up something that I didn't even actually mention in the webinar, but is really pretty critical to, I think, a lot of this.
Well, thank you very much. Another one from Kathy Catcher. The question is, as more teams move to virtual working, how do you build those personal connections when you all are working apart?
Yeah, great question, because I think there's more and more of that, and I think that's only going to increase. I think we're going to have more virtual teams and virtual workspaces in the future, and I think that makes all of the stuff that I just said that much trickier and that much more important. I think especially the relationship piece. I think you can build relationships virtually, but I think it's a little bit harder than when you can spend time and hang out with each other. So I think you do have to be intentional about setting aside some time to you know, connect with each other on the phone or video or even over emails, but getting to know each other and really focusing on building that relationship. I think it's easier to misunderstand and miscommunicate and misinterpret each other when we're spread out, and so that trust piece and that relationship is even more important. And I think a lot of leaders, and I think a lot of HR folks understand this, understand the importance of relationships. The thing that seems to get overlooked is that we have to be very intentional about doing it. We have to actually set aside, we have to actually budget time for that. Otherwise, it just doesn't happen. It's one of those things that we know it's important, but it doesn't seem urgent, and so it just doesn't happen. So being very intentional about budgeting time and energy and resources every week or every month to do a little bit of that relationship building, I think is important, and probably twice as important if you have virtual teams. Being creative and intentional about building those relationships. Fortunately, we have, more so than ever before, we have all of these social tools at our disposal that help us do some of that. Really building trust on a virtual team 20 years ago was much more difficult than it is today. At least we have a lot of different tools and vehicles to communicate and get to know each other today.
Okay, we have another one from Brother Assad. Oh, sorry. The question is, how can I make the team to trust themselves and be open?
Well, I'm not sure what you understand by trust themselves. The open piece, I think, again, it takes time, it takes some intention, it takes some effort, and I think you can start small, especially if you have a team that just isn't used to maybe disagreeing with each other and pushing on each other a little bit, which is true of a lot of teams. One of the practices that I work with a little bit is, first of all, I start having conversations about the importance of disagreeing with each other. I try to set the expectation that my belief is if you gather a group of human beings together to talk about something that matters, you can either have disagreement or you can have dishonesty. And as a leader, you should choose wisely because there are great consequences to that decision. We are different people. We see things differently. A certain amount of disagreement is natural. Doesn't mean we have to fight tooth and nail over everything, but we're naturally going to disagree with each other. If that's not showing up in our conversations, then something is wrong with how we're having our conversations. That disagreement, as long as it shows up before the decision has been made, is really, really valuable. So a lot of this work is about people telling the truth to each other. And I think sometimes they have to start small if they haven't been used to that. One of the practices that I use quite a bit is the devil's advocate. Every time we get together as a team, someone is going to be randomly assigned the role of devil's advocate. It's just their job for this meeting to disagree, to push back, to ask questions. It's not personal, right? Because it's just my job this time, and we just get used to it. We build those muscles. We get used to disagreeing with each other instead of freaking out when it happens, which is kind of the case right now. So I think those things are all kind of an important part of it. I have conversations with them about the importance of disagreement, about how easy it is to slip into groupthink. I sometimes share stories like the space shuttle story with them to remind them of the dangers of groupthink, and then I try to help them start experimenting with disagreeing with each other, but making it a very intentional process. If we haven't been disagreeing and we're going to start disagreeing right now, then after that meeting, let's have another conversation and talk about how it went. Let's take it very step by step and be very intentional about it, because the truth is that it appears to be very dangerous to employees a lot of times. If I don't know it's safe for me to disagree with my peers, if I don't know that it's safe for me to disagree with my supervisor, if that hasn't been proven crystal clear to me, then the chances are I'm not going to do it. And just that quickly and quietly, you get less than the full participation of people on the payroll. So I think you do have to kind of take it step by step. You have to build that trust as you go and build those practices and tools that are going to work for you, but having conversations about it, experimenting with the devil's advocate, those have both proven to be effective ways to get started for me.
Thank you very much. Another one, short one. What are some of the steps you could suggest for consensus-based decision makings within the teams?
Another good question, consensus-based decision making. I'm bumping into more organizations that believe in consensus-style decision making. One of the interesting things that I bump up against, though, with the consensus approach and with some other approaches is that even though we've said we're going to make decision by consensus, there's still a lot of different opinions and beliefs about what that actually means. I recently asked an organization, and this is an organization that, like, as an organization, they've endorsed this model. They make all of their decisions by consensus, and they're very proud of it. They talk about it in the hiring process. It's kind of one of the things that they're proud of. I had some time with the executive team. There's maybe six or seven people on the executive team, and I asked each of them to describe what that meant. What does it mean to make decisions as consensus? Like, diagram or narrate the process for me. And there was quite a bit of variance between the executives in what it meant to use a consensus approach to decision making. So regardless of what approach you use, be very specific, clear, concise, and explicit as to what that means. There's a lot of words that are interpreted a lot of different ways by a lot of people. Sketch it out, talk about what it is, talk about what it's not, and make sure that in that process you also talk about, when we deviate from this in some way, what is it my responsibility to do? But I think that the consensus model is a departure for a lot of folks. So I think if you are going to embrace that model, and I think all models have pros and cons, but if you are going to embrace that model, I think it has to be kind of a slow process. You have to experiment with it and teach people and train people, and that's probably true of all of those models. And I think one of the challenges that you bump up against is just difference of philosophy. If it's an existing organization that's now going to move to a consensus model, you may very well have a lot of people in your organization that philosophically don't believe in consensus, and so before you adopt it, you might want to have some conversations about that. Some of these approaches to making decisions are kind of rooted in our fundamental beliefs about individuals and groups and justice and truth and all of those things, and so you may bump into some challenges there. If you are going to adopt it, you can kind of set those expectations up front moving forward, but you may have some people in your organization, even at very senior levels, that really just don't believe in or buy into the consensus model. So you might have some work to do on the front end, building the business case, explaining to people what it is and why it's the right way for you. That's probably a valuable part of it as well. But making sure that when people across the organization are in those meetings, making sure that they have clear, explicit expectations in front of them as to what the consensus model is and how it works and how they're expected to participate. The more explicit that can be, the easier it is for people to fully participate in those processes. And I think a lot of times there's some opportunities to do some actual training and development for the leadership folks that are going to be facilitating that consensus approach to decision making. Sorry, that was a long rambling answer, but hopefully there was one or two things of value to you in there.
Well, thank you very much, and that really brings us towards the end of the webinar. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
Not at all. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that each of you leaves here with something of value.
Indeed. Thank you very much. I really want to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE, for taking the time to share this presentation live with our participants and attendees. So thank you very much, and thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. We are recording it. Please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org to learn about our upcoming programs and webinars, and equally to access the archive section. With that note, I would like to end and conclude this session, so you all will be automatically dismissed out. You all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Wassalamu alaikum.